Boss is you.
Thank you. Dear guests and speakers, as Bahçeşehir University School of Government and Leadership, we are honored to present you the guest speakers of today's final panel. Senior Fellow of Atlantic Council, Ambassador Madrid Principles, Senior Vice President of American Foreign Policy Council, Ilan Berman, and President of Global Policy Institute, Paolo von Schirach, will be with us to discuss the present and future of American foreign policy with the moderation of political analyst and journalist Metehan Demir. We are looking forward to receive the contributions of our guests. Next up, USA 2050.
Thank you very much. And maybe we should rename this seminar as the meeting of heavyweights, because I'm so much actually honored to host these three distinguished guests. It's my great honor and pleasure to welcome all three participants. And also many thanks to dear friend Burak Küntay, who is the president of School of Government and Leadership at Bahçeşehir University. Today we are together for the last session, today's last session of Global Leadership Forum 2021. Thanks for being with us again. Yes, as I say, we are together with three eminent experienced speakers, and we'll talk about US-Turkish relations, US global policies and its reflections on the global scale. Of course, their views and opinions, our guests' opinions and views, will help us to understand better this complicated global environment in the light of this COVID-19 epidemic process. Let me introduce once again our dear speakers today. Former Ambassador Matthew Bryza, non-resident fellow at Atlantic Council. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Demir. Thank you. Honored to be here.
Like Turkey, it's my honor. Like Turkish name, İlhan, but we say Ilan Berman, Senior Vice President of American Foreign Policy Council. Welcome again, Mr. Berman.
Oh, good to see everybody.
And finally, Paolo von Schirach, President of Global Policy Institute. Welcome again, Mr. von Schirach.
Thank you.
And thanks to share your views with this distinguished audience. Today, we will have 1.5 hours approximately, and each speaker will have for each question up to 8 or 9 minutes, depending on how the topic is heavy. So, and please feel free, as I said before, add any extra points or views that could be important from point of your view. And now let's start with, if you allow me, let's start with Mr. Matt Bryza. He is in Turkey, and that's why he's so close to us. Maybe our question can reach him actually faster. Now, so I know you actually for years, your trips to Ankara, your powerful positions at the State Department and the US administration, and also in US foreign policy circle. Let's start with the actually first question. And as you know, let's start with actually this so-called, because you are so close to these subjects as I'm aware of, the so-called Armenian genocide claims have been a critical issue between Turkey and United States for years and for decades actually. Without waiting a historical commission decision or result, unlike previous presidents, US presidents, President Biden used the word genocide to describe the events. And why and how would this affect relations, especially legal cases against Turkey? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Mr. Demir, for that question. When I was spending 4 years at the National Security Council staff at the White House, it was one of my jobs was every year to write the first draft of the Armenian Remembrance Day statement that at that time President George W. Bush would issue. And subsequently, 4 more years after I left the White House, someone else did it. 4 years of the Obama administration, the same thing happened. And never was the word genocide used. Sometimes the statements got close to it. For example, 1 year after I left, the president used the word Metzgeren, which means the great calamity in Armenian, and that's the actual phrase that Armenian people use to call it the genocide. And so nobody disputed what actually happened in the White House. There are many people in Turkey who dispute what happened. I mean, there are different accounts as to whether or not there were intentional killings, whether or not the Armenians who were displaced simply died by accident. In any case, no U.S. president used the word. I mean, Ronald Reagan did, but briefly, and he retracted his use of the word genocide way back when in the 1980s. And the reason for that non-usage of the word was because there's great debate about whether or not it was. There's a United Nations definition of the word genocide. And if you look at it, the definition is so expansive. It's so broad that, you know, somebody could argue that even killing one person because of their ethnicity or their religion or their race, that could be termed genocide. Even one person, if that person was killed because they're a member of a certain group. So everything hinges on the intent. When these killings happen, was there what the United Nations calls genocidal intent? In Washington, there's one grouping. It's the Dashnak Sütun grouping in the United States, so the Armenian Revolutionary Front. Its branch in Washington is called the Armenian National Committee of America. And they were the ones who blocked my nomination to be ambassador to Azerbaijan by convincing 2 U.S. senators to prevent there from being a vote. At the end of the day, then President Obama was able to circumvent their opposition, even though they're in the Democratic Party. And they were motivated by the Armenian National Committee of America, who pays a lot of money to individual members of Congress and to their campaigns. What they do, what the Armenian National Committee does is they launch tirades in the media, now on social media, of anyone who says, well, wait a second, we're not so certain that the Ottoman leadership back then had genocidal intent, because we don't know what the intent is. As soon as you say, well, I'm not sure what the intent was, how do I know historically, then you're attacked and branded as a genocide denier, which then becomes that you are you don't respect human rights, you're anti-Armenian, and you favor mass killings. So that's one reason. That's one reason why there's such pressure on President Biden to say genocide. Also, then President Obama, when he was running for office during the campaign, he promised to use the word genocide, and he didn't. He didn't in the end, because I think he weighed the factors I just discussed about what is genocidal intent, and of course, because strategic relations with Turkey are so important. And Turkey always made very loud noises, huge complaining, when in the Congress, rather than the presidency, there were declarations and moves toward declaring the events of 1915 genocide. And so there was a lot of momentum for strategic reasons against recognizing genocide. And then on top of it all, there were multiple genocides, as we all know, occurring in Eastern Anatolia at that period. It was the end of World War I. It was the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. There was a civil war going on inside the Ottoman Empire. History's record is very muddled. All that being said, Joe Biden said during the campaign, I am going to recognize the genocide. And he appears to be a leader really who sticks to his principles, a man of his word who doesn't want to say no or doesn't want to contradict himself. He wants to deliver on his promises. So he used the word. And the reaction has been, I think you might agree, Mr. Demir, here in Turkey, pretty muted, quiet. It's almost as if the government realized this was going to happen or was likely to happen. They sort of priced in investment terms this development by President Biden, and the government has largely moved on. And President Erdogan was just saying in the last couple of days that his upcoming meeting with President Biden will usher in a new era in U.S.-Turkey relations. So my hope is that this horribly painful debate about history is finished. And the last comment is the Armenian National Committee of America doesn't want a debate on the history, because the history is much more complicated than the oversimplified view they paint, which demonizes Turks, whether they're from Ottoman Turkey or from Azerbaijan. If you know the real history, and if the Armenian National Committee of America allowed the Dashnak archives, which they control in Waterville, Massachusetts, if they allowed those archives to be open and there to be a real objective study of what happened, the picture would be very, very complicated and nobody would come out looking good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone who would like to add something else on this subject? Mr. Berman, Mr. von Schreck?
Yeah,
Please.
I'd like to, so I think Matt did a masterful job of sort of explaining the complexity. And I think that's particularly important because it's quite a heated debate here and quite a heated debate in Turkey, at least on a private level, between people who frankly don't know the complexity of the history and sort of, are sort of, our current political climate, especially in the United States, lends itself to very rapid assumptions and not a lot of political discussion. But the one thing that I think might be useful is to sort of to understand it in the context of the Biden administration's foreign policy writ large, not just between Washington and Ankara, but actually the way the administration is thinking globally. Because what you've begun to see is this administration, perhaps in reaction to the Trump administration, perhaps for its own convictions, right? It is very hard to tell, but has steadily elevated the question of human rights on its foreign policy agenda. So I know that for my Turkish friends, certainly, it's very easy to assume that this was a strictly bilateral transaction or interaction. This was a US-Turkey, this was a US message being sent to Turkey. But I would actually argue that it's proper to look at it through the lens of the way the US is beginning to position itself vis-a-vis China, for example, and its global response to Chinese persecution of the Uyghur Muslim minority in Western China, the way the US is beginning to reorient its policy towards Saudi Arabia to emphasize more things like human rights. Now, to be clear, this is not across the board. There are places, for example, like Iran, where there are tremendous human rights violations that are taking place that the administration has not yet focused on for a whole host of reasons. But I think it's proper to understand this in the context of sort of how the administration is beginning to think globally about human rights. And also, because politics is the art of the possible, it's necessary to understand that for the Biden administration, this is a fairly easy political step for a very simple reason, because it's a historical event. It's not something that's happening now. It doesn't precipitate any US action now. President Biden can recognize it and move on. As Matt said, we can sort of close the chapter. There's nobody who's alive today in Turkey in positions of leadership that was involved. There's no causal action in Washington that needs to be done to punish anybody. So as a declaratory statement, it may ruffle some feathers in Ankara, absolutely, as it has. But in terms of actual US policy, it doesn't really change much.
One more thing I know Paolo may want to go, but I want to build on one point Ilan made as well, that once the Biden administration and once Secretary of State Blinken recognized what's happening to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang as genocide, that sort of made it almost inevitable from a political perspective, from a US political perspective, that then President Biden would have to call it the Armenian genocide. That's all I wanted to add.
Mr. Schreck?
I don't know that I have much to add. I fully agree with both my colleagues here, and especially I would like to echo what Ilan just said. This administration, for whatever reasons, and I hope it has a good strategy, is relaunching the old, Jimmy Carter human rights, campaign and trying to hit strategic opponents on the human rights issue. And therefore, as Ilan pointed out, dredging again, the Armenian issue is a low cost, easy thing to do in an environment. And please, forgive me if I sound a bit cynical here. I would bet that if I go around Washington here and I ask 100 people that I meet, where is Armenia? They would have no idea. All right. If they say, what about the events at the end of the Ottoman Empire? They would have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about. Nothing. So who knows about this? The activists that Matthew, correctly educated us about, and their pretty well organized lobbying efforts. The fact that Biden promised, and so he said, okay, I'm going to do it, and then he did it. And the broader issue that Ilan referred to of elevating human rights as a driving point of American, how can I say, in a way, aggressive foreign policy, trying to hit political enemies, strategic enemies. particularly China here, where we believe it may hurt. I am not, frankly, and maybe this is for another conversation, I am skeptical about the success of this. I don't really think it works very well, but I think I understand the intent. And certainly now that we, as Elon pointed out, and Matthew, I guess also, that we called the treatment of the Muslim minority in China, the Uyghur genocide. Well, it follows, if that is a genocide, then there are at least 10 or 15 other instances in history that probably qualify under the label of genocide. So it seems like this is now baked in the cake. And as everybody, I think, here agrees, it didn't cause a major international crisis. And the government in Ankara, while displeased, is moving on. And we have other things to do. And so I think probably this matter that used to resurface, cyclically every year is probably put to rest.
Thank you very much. In my opinion, the history should be actually left to historians, and it's not the business of politicians. So maybe the committees and the commissions that Turkey offered so far, maybe one day will be realized, but we'll see the results. But probably Turkey attaches a lot of importance on the upcoming summit between President Erdogan and President Biden on 14th of June in Brussels for NATO summit. We'll see the results, but to be honest, as a citizen of Turkey, this actually announcement by Biden to actually name the events as genocide seriously jeopardized the Turkish people's hearts. Anyway, Mr. Berman, I know you have been following Middle East very closely for years, and you are closely interested in. So I've been also covering Middle East, and what I noticed that President Biden always emphasized that he's so concerned about human rights. And we actually touched on this issue very shortly. So as he claims, and then why he's returning blind eye on Gaza and the events happening in Gaza, because traditional Democrats, such as I remember Clinton and Obama, were more critical towards Netanyahu and Israel. Yes, I have seen several actually explanations from US administration that criticize Israelis, but not that much. Is this a kind of inconsistency with previous Democrat presidents? Also, additional one, how would this Biden policy affect Turkey's ties with United States regarding the ongoing developments and Israel aggression? As you know, Turkey is very sensitive and very hard on Palestinian issue. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Demir. I appreciate you leaving the easy question for me. So let me see if I can address the Israeli-Palestinian question first, and hopefully I can sort of shed some light. Yeah. So first of all, I think it's necessary to understand it's an issue that captures an enormous amount of passion in the Middle East, enormous amount of attention globally in the Middle East, in Europe, in the United States. But I would have to say that at least here from Washington, watching the current round of violence as it's unfolded, I've been struck by how much it's been mischaracterized. Because what you're actually talking about is not one conflict, but two. There's an internal problem that Israel has in terms of inequality of access to Jerusalem, unequal status for Israeli Arabs in Israeli court rulings, things like that. The things that were the proximate local causes of the unrest that took place in Israel. And then you have an external conflict. And the external conflict is when a group like Hamas, which the US designates a foreign terrorist organization, started attacking the state of Israel. And I think it's probably Israel's own fault that it hasn't really emphasized the first. And so everything looks like it's lumped together. There's really not a lot of clarity about this being two separate issues. But the Biden administration, I think, understands this, and it has to tread very carefully because among other things, one of the interesting nuances, there's a phrase in English that says, all politics is ultimately local. And I think that's true in the Palestinian context as well, because Hamas, for its part, launched its rocket campaign against Israel right after the Palestinian Authority decided to cancel elections. And there were elections, and if you look at all the polling, and there's a tremendous amount of open source polling available, elections in which Hamas was projected to possibly do better than the Palestinian Authority in terms of leadership. And that may have been the reason why Palestinian Authority Chairman Mahmoud Abbas decided to cancel the elections indefinitely, to postpone them indefinitely. But the end result was that Hamas is not an impartial actor. Hamas is an interested actor, and it wanted to elevate its status on the Palestinian national political scene. And that's at least part of the motivation. The problem for the United States is that as far as American law is concerned, Hamas is not a legitimate political party. So now you have this really interesting dynamic that's in play. President Biden, because of these complexities, decided to take a backseat, decided to let Egypt essentially run the de-escalation conversations. Egypt was in charge of everything that led to the ceasefire, and the US stepped in at the last minute to take credit. But now President Biden has stepped out from behind and said that he would allocate money, $64 million, I believe is the price tag, for the reconstruction of Gaza. But here's the problem. It's not clear who is going to do the reconstruction of Gaza, because under US law, America cannot give money to the people who govern Gaza because they're designated as a foreign terrorist organization. So I lay all this out just to explain the complexities that every American administration, whether it's Republican or Democrat, has in dealing with the dual nature of the Palestinian Authority, the dual nature of governance between the West Bank and Gaza. This administration, I think, is much more interested in restarting Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, but it's confronting the same problem that previous administrations did, which is which Palestinians are we allowed to talk to? Which Palestinians can we talk to? How do we talk to them without disadvantaging others, right? These are all complicated questions. And so I think that at least partially explains the passivity of the Biden administration. I think they understand that this is a very, very complicated conflict. But I would say this, that the Biden administration has demonstrated, I think, much more appetite, much more interest in, even despite the complexity of the problem, restarting the dialogue. For a long time, the Israeli government has proceeded along the notion that the Palestinian issue is one to be managed instead of being solved, that they were going to essentially do everything else with the Arab world and not really look at the Palestinians. And this was something that I think was reinforced under the 4 years of the Trump administration. The Biden administration seems to want to take a more activist role, but as it does over the next weeks and months, it's going to have to deal with the complexity of the situation.
May I add something to this? Thank you.
Please.
I fully agree with what Ilan has said, and he certainly knows about these matters a lot more than I ever will. But my general perspective is this: the Middle East broadly, I'm sorry if I'm taking kind of a stratospheric look at this, the Middle East is less and less important in American foreign policy, except for the Iran nuclear issue, which is still a burning problem, for which, frankly, we don't know what the best approach should be. The Trump administration, with all its messiness and all its chaos, has demonstrated, and we have to give credit where credit is due, that it is possible for Israel to engage with at least some key players in the Arab world without solving the Palestinian issue. For decades, we were told nothing can be done in the Middle East until and unless the Palestinian issue is resolved in a satisfactory manner. Well, the Abraham Accords, whatever they're called, demonstrated that this is not true, that it is possible, at least with some carefully selected members of the Arab world, to strike deals irrespective of the status of Jerusalem. There was another issue that was supposed to unleash chaos in the world, and it didn't. When finally it was, one may dispute and disagree, but fundamentally the recognition of the de facto state that Jerusalem is the capital of the Jewish state. So what I'm trying to say is that this is not a front burner issue. It is not. It's become now, it flared up because of American media, which is instinctively pro-Palestinian, and the left of the Democratic Party, which is instinctively pro-Palestinian. It is a common, way of describing Israel here in left-wing publications and media as an apartheid state. That's it kind of goes quite almost unchallenged. And I think that's, it's a bit of an exaggeration to say the least. And of course, what prompted this renewed activism on the part of the Biden administration, where the news reports, of course, of the bombings, the Israeli bombings of Gaza, and children being killed. And of course, oh my God, look what the Israelis are doing. Put a stop to that. This is cruelty. They're killing babies and all that. Forgetting to mention the fact that Hamas keeps rocket launchers, among civilians. And this is why, unfortunately, these areas are targeted. And I just would add the statistical, not irrelevant fact that Gaza is the third most densely populated area in the world. Okay, so you got 2 million people bunched up in a very small space. You got a terrorist organization that launches rockets indiscriminately into Israel, and apparently Israel is supposed to do nothing because otherwise you kill civilians. So this is kind of a messy situation. I do not believe, quite frankly, that the Biden administration has got really anything at all new and genuine to add. In other words, is there going to be a Biden plan for the two-state solution implementation? Maybe, but I don't think it will be pursued with great emphasis. I hope in the next, as we continue this conversation, we will see that there's the different fish to fry. The Biden administration main focus, priority 1, 2, and 3 is China, not the Middle East, not Israel, not Gaza, not the Palestinians.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Braiza, anything else to add?
Yeah. First of all, I'm pleasantly surprised to hear from Ilan that the Biden administration seems to be ready to get engaged to pursue or to restore dialogue between the Palestinian Authority, not Hamas, and the government of Israel. So great. But I very much agree with Paulo that in the beginning, before this crisis, before the rockets started flying from Gaza, the Biden administration didn't want to touch this issue at all. It was seen as a loser issue for them. They weren't going to make progress. They viewed the Jared Kushner's Middle East peace plan as having been weighted heavily toward the Palestinians. And early in the administration, when they've got so many other priorities, one of which is getting back into the Iran nuclear deal, but also, as Paulo was saying, China, not to mention managing the pandemic globally, and Russia, and pulling out of Afghanistan. This was too much for the Biden administration to deal with so early on, but they got pulled in. And it was inevitable they'd get pulled in when the violence got to the level it is. What is different, though? There is something that's different this time. Getting back to your original question, Mr. Demir, which is really about, isn't the Biden administration following a double standard by not caring about the welfare of the Palestinians? Beyond the financial assistance that Ilan talked about, the Biden administration did something unusual in that Secretary Blinken and then President Biden very clearly called for the rights of the Palestinians to be respected, whether it be their property rights, whether it be they're being treated as a second-class citizens, as Ilan mentioned. Across the board, their rights need to be respected, is what Secretary Blinken said when he was just meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu earlier this week. And Netanyahu himself, during that same exchange, said, yes, we need to protect the rights of the Palestinians. That's new. Maybe it's lip service. Maybe he just needs, or he wants to prevent the Israeli Arabs from joining with Mr. Lapid and form a government that will oust him, Netanyahu, which will result in him going to prison. But his recognition of the need to do more to protect the rights of Palestinians seemed new for me. Ilan may have a different view.
Thank you very much. When I was a student at the King's College, beginning of 2000, it was 2001, just after the 9/11 attacks in London. The first essay our lecturer, Mr. Lawrence Friedman, was asked to write us was "Winning Hearts and Minds in Middle East." So I think such an aggression by Israel and such an policy by United States to drag the feet on Middle East will not help, in my opinion, to winning hearts and minds in Middle East, because when I travel to the region, I always realize, except some Arab countries to actually a rising hatred against the United States and the Western world. And sincere bridges should be actually set up in the future. Otherwise, including the immigration flows into West, will not help us this ongoing situation. This is my opinion. You actually, if you agree or not, I totally respect. Mr. Paulo von Schirach, I have a question about a global issue. It's COVID-19. As you know, regarding this COVID-19 virus, US and China have been putting blame at each other. I remember an announcement by Mr. Dr. Fauci in actually recent days that he is not still convinced that this actual virus is natural. How would this confrontational approach reflect to a new world order? And what should be the Turkey's position in this quagmire?
Well, thank you. Look, the issue of about the origin of COVID-19, which is being debated, litigated, rediscussed as we speak. Mr. Biden, I guess, just ordered a final kind of intelligence report, I believe, to be delivered within 90 days, if I'm not mistaken. So okay, let's make a determination. Quite frankly, I don't think it's possible to make a determination as to if we want to do a sort of a forensic analysis of what happened, simply because the Chinese lie on a daily basis about everything concerning to this matter. I'm sorry, I'm being rather abrupt, but this is the record. They are not certainly, for full disclosure and transparency. When the WHO sent its own team to investigate and find out, that they could see a few things, but they were precluded. No, not this one, not get here. No, we don't tell you that. So quite frankly, we don't have the information. At this point, to be honest with you, establishing as to whether COVID-19 originates from bats and the wet markets in Wuhan, or from a lab, and it has kind of escaped because somebody was doing some kind of experimentations, and it would appear some researchers there got sick. It appears in the end of 2019. It may be interesting from a medical and epidemiological standpoint. It's interesting to know the origin of a pathogen. I am not a physician. I don't even begin to understand the complexity of all of this, but let's move forward. What is at stake right now is the role that the United States and or China can play to mitigate the impact of this global pandemic in an effective way. I believe that America has a unique opportunity, being in the lead as it is in the pursuit and development of very successful vaccines that we do have. And that even though the Trump administration made a huge mess of the handling of the pandemic at the beginning, fundamentally based on the biases and silly ideas saying, well, it doesn't really exist, or maybe it's a whole Democratic Party ploy, or it will go away by itself, or yes, if you drink Lysol, you'll get better. I mean, that kind of stuff was really, really detrimental to the proper handling of all this. However, the Trump administration also launched Operation Warp Speed, which meant a fast tracking and development of the vaccine. So let's fast forward to today, where we are now. We've got the vaccines. More than half of the American population has been vaccinated, myself included. Thank you very much. And so the opportunity for the Biden administration is to be extremely aggressive in trying to develop whatever can be done in terms of added capacity and distribution, so that the pandemic, which is now completely out of control in countries such as India, to mitigate this as much as possible for a variety of reasons. One is clearly the health of the world population, but the other one is to reestablish America as a leader in global public health, which we have all the credentials, all the tools, all the talent in the world to do so. The fact is that we just need to refocus now that the domestic situation is, I wouldn't say solved, that would be too optimistic, but at least more under control, and to extend a hand to places like Africa, which is a complete disaster due to lack of resources, or India because of the mishandling. But even we see Japan and Vietnam and South Korea right now where it's flaring up. So America should do whatever it can and keep this going for as long as is necessary in order to mitigate the impact of the pandemic. The Biden administration just announced its own budget. That's going to be $6 trillion, okay? So in other words, there is no spending for domestic priority mostly. What I'm trying to say, it's not that we're not doing these things for lack of money. I think it has to be focused and resolved, and this is where it can really make a difference. Good luck to the Chinese to sell their vaccines, which seem to be not particularly good, to Bolivia and Brazil and South Africa. I think in the end, the evidence will show which products, which vaccines are better. But in the meantime, it is incumbent on the United States to show leadership and be on top of this and try to do its best to supply vaccines to countries that badly need it right now.
Thank you. Mr. Berman, do you think that actually China or somebody else in the world produced this virus, or it's just the result of bats or fish markets?
Well, so this is precisely the big debate that's taking place in the United States.
That's why. Because you're in Washington, right? That's why I asked you. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No, and I think that's exactly the right question. Look, here's how I see it. A century ago, the German psychiatrist Hermann Rorschach came up with this famous test in which he poured ink on a piece of paper and asked his patient to identify: is this a bird? Is this your mother? Is this whatever it is? The origins of COVID-19 is a political Rorschach test for the American people right now. It is, first of all, a test about Trump, meaning there's so much polarization taking place in the United States right now that if the Trump administration said that the origins were a laboratory, then many people in the American electorate automatically say, well, it can't be that. And you saw that happening in terms of the press coverage. And I frankly think that's enormously detrimental, because the role of the media should be to try to investigate as much as possible, not to jump to conclusions because they don't like a certain political outcome. And the second is, it's a Rorschach test about what Americans think about China, whether we think China is a responsible stakeholder or not a responsible stakeholder. And I would argue that tracking this debate and watching how the laboratory theory has gained legitimacy in the American public, now after Trump, sort of now in the Biden era, is a very accurate barometer of how much the American public has grown to understand the true nature of the Chinese Communist Party, has grown to distrust it, has grown to really question, as Paulo said, really question sort of the fundamentals behind it. And the answer is we don't know. But what you have is increasingly an appetite on the part of the US government and also on the part of the American people to try to not dismiss the idea out of hand. And if this is a theory that is plausible, and I think it's increasingly clear that it is plausible, there's two separate potential avenues. One is that it was the accidental product of something called gain of function. And scientists do this all the time, right? They take naturally occurring diseases and they try to improve upon them as a way of finding more potent antidotes. So gain of function accident that went awry, or it's an intentional development, intentional optimization of an existing virus, right? Those drive you in very, very different conclusions. One is a conclusion about, what are the lessons we have for global health and about global health standards and how in international cooperation. The other is China and biowarfare, and it's a very different conversation. Paulo's main point, though, I think is exactly correct. The character for danger in Mandarin Chinese is the combined character for both crisis and opportunity. And I think that's precisely where we are right now. For the United States especially, we have handled despite sort of all the craziness of the Trump era, we have handled the pandemic very well. We have over 50% of the population, adult population, vaccinated. Increasingly, children from 12 and up are becoming vaccinated. My children are both vaccinated. And so we're in an optimal position vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And what we do with that position becomes, I think, very important for America's global credibility. I'll give you a great example. The Biden administration is very invested in restarting negotiations with Iran, to the point where they've done everything from relaxing enforcement of existing sanctions on Iranian oil exports to offering Iran $1 billion in humanitarian aid to assist with the coronavirus. And here, this is, myself included, I find this a really not useful approach, not because the Iranians don't deserve humanitarian aid, but because if we give $1 billion to the Iranian government directly, you can be sure that it won't be used for humanitarian aid or to alleviate the crisis. But the United States has stockpiles of millions of doses of coronavirus vaccine. And we can use that not only as a health diplomacy tool for countries like India, we can also use that as a geopolitical tool to advance our own strategic objectives. So I'm very heartened that the Biden administration is beginning to sort of to understand this and beginning to move to use health diplomacy, in a strategic fashion. It's something that the Chinese and the Russians have been doing for months and months now, even though their domestic situations are much worse. So I'm glad that we're catching up.
Mr. Raiza, you look like you have something to tell us.
Yeah, I want to go back to your question. Is the Biden administration using the claims that the coronavirus might have escaped from a Chinese lab as part of a confrontational approach? And what should Turkey do? So I don't believe the Biden administration is trying to confront China on this issue. I mean, of all people, Dr. Anthony Fauci, he's the one who has most credibly been trying to tamp down all that sort of speculation. When President Trump was referring to the China virus and the Kung Fu flu, I think that was that really, I think, troubled people on the Democratic side, going back to the Rorschach test that Ilan was talking about. And in fact, that reverberated inside the United States, and it appears a significant uptick in hate crimes against Asian Americans, right? Including physical assaults and even murders. So I think there's no chance the Biden administration would want to use this particular issue as a political weapon against China, and just really honestly is wrestling with the unknowability at this point, as Paolo was saying, about how this really all began, meaning the coronavirus. That said, while Biden's tone in foreign policy, especially toward China, is much different from President Trump's more bombastic and threatening approach, the underlying objectives of the Biden administration are the same, right? It's to deter Chinese adventurism and expansionism in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. In other words, to be able to deter Chinese military action and pivot toward Asia, which is something that the Obama administration said it wanted to do, but never really accomplished. And then secondly, protecting technology and intellectual property against the Chinese stealing it, basically. And then thirdly, managing the trade relationship with China much more effectively. Those are all Trump administration objectives. What is different with the Biden administration, and this gets to the point about Turkey, is that President Biden believes that the only way the U.S. can really be successful in countering aggressive Chinese behavior, whether it's in the military sphere or the economic sphere, that is through working together with our allies and having a united front. And so not fighting a trade war at once with China, with Mexico and Canada, and with our European allies all at the same time. And for a while, that was happening in the Trump administration. So Turkey faces a tough choice here. It seems the choice to me is obvious. You go with your NATO ally, the United States. Turkey is a transatlantic family member. Whether or not Turkey remains in lockstep with the rhetoric of Washington, that's not an issue. Of course it won't. But the choice Turkey is facing seems obvious to me. However, China is offering a lot in terms of its Belt and Road initiative, in terms of investment and all kinds of loans with strings attached to many countries to the east of China. east of Turkey. But at the end of the day, my guess is Turkey is going to behave as a reliable NATO ally. As President Erdogan announced or reaffirmed this past week, and which was announced over a year ago, Turkey, one of its main objectives, economic objectives in the foreign sphere, is to elevate U.S.-Turkey trade up to $100 billion per year from $20 billion. That's going to be very difficult to achieve for a number of reasons. First and foremost, that the U.S. president doesn't have the same degree of authority to, how to put it, stimulate trading relationships in a particular direction that the Turkish leadership has. But nonetheless, the fact that this remains a major objective of Turkey's economic foreign policy lends me to believe that at the end of the day, Turkey is going to stand with the United States and the rest of the transatlantic family, even as the United States continues to compete with European allies as well. My last point is, President Biden likes to call his foreign policy the foreign policy for the middle class. For the middle class, that means jobs. And so I think that's going to mean sustained steel tariffs for a while to protect American manufacturing jobs in the steel sector. And that creates difficulty in the U.S.-Turkey trading relationship and U.S.-European trading relationship, because steel is an important component of bilateral trade in both instances. Thank you.
Thank you. We are in the middle of a nice, lovely, and exciting actually discussion, and we are still continuing to discuss global, local, bilateral, and regional issues. So thanks, three of you as well, again. Matthew Bryce, if possible, I would like to continue with you. Given the fragile ceasefire in Caucasus, actually, you are very well experienced diplomat and very well-known name in this area as well. This Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict, when we look at this conflict, how do you see the future of this problem, war, or quagmire, or actually series of crises? Because the pressure is still going on. Could you elaborate the issue in terms of Russia, United States, Armenia, and Turkey? Also, maybe we can add some Western countries like France.
Thanks. Yeah, I spent a chunk of my career as the U.S. mediator of the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Didn't work, but we did have we actually, together, the mediators with the leaders of Azerbaijan and Armenia, did help them formulate and agree in principle to a framework to settle the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict called the Madrid Principles, or the basic principles. It's called the Madrid Principles because we put this proposal on the table in, I guess, November of 2007 during the OSCE's foreign ministers meeting in Madrid. And if you look at the November 10 statement, ceasefire statement that ended that military phase of this last 44-day war, it is very similar to the Madrid Principles, very similar. And the idea of the Madrid Principles is that there's only one way to get to a settlement of the conflict, and that's first and foremost to make the legal status of Nagorno-Karabakh itself ambiguous. Don't talk about it. Let the Armenian side claim it's possible that Nagorno-Karabakh is going to be either independent or part of Armenia. Let the Azerbaijani side claim, no, that's never going to happen. Nagorno-Karabakh is always going to be part of Azerbaijan. Just look at international law. No country on earth has ever recognized Nagorno-Karabakh as anything other than part of Azerbaijan, including Armenia. So if you talk about the status issue, you get nowhere. So our plan was always resolve the other big issues that need to be resolved before you can tackle the status issue. So that was the return of the 7 territories surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh that Armenia occupied in violation of 4 United Nations Security Council resolutions, which were never enforced, as most UN Security Council resolutions aren't. And then it was also to provide a sense of security for the Armenians who will remain in Nagorno-Karabakh, which would include, among other things, a peacekeeping force and other things as well. So it was a land for peace deal, which will sound familiar to anybody who's followed the Israeli-Palestinian question for decades, like Ilan. And so the Armenian Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan, who came to power extremely popularly, right? Thanks to street protests, peaceful protests, who wanted to, with protesters wanting to throw away the old corrupt hardline regime, something the United States embraced. Pashinyan began a whole series of reforms, but he also, I think because he had to protect his nationalist flank, decided to throw that land for peace formula away. And instead, a couple of years ago, he started talking about new wars for new territories. So he completely flipped the whole equation on its head. And that led inevitably to this war, because Azerbaijan had made clear for decades, it will follow a peaceful path, it will negotiate in good faith, only until it loses faith in the negotiating process. And Azerbaijan lost faith, and we got the war. The outcome, as I said, is very similar to what was outlined by those basic principles, except that the question of status is not included in the November 10th ceasefire statement, because Azerbaijan won the war. For me, this situation is fair. It's just because, again, in principle, Armenia's leader it was in January 2009, then President Serge Sargsyan, agreed to this formula. However, of course, with the possibility that the legal status of Nagorno-Karabakh could someday change. Armenia lost that when it lost the war. It was offered these same principles throughout the war, at least 3 times. Pashinyan agreed, and then the ceasefire was violated. So to me, the basic structure of the outcome is stable. The presence of Russian peacekeepers was essential. I am no fan of Russian peacekeepers. I also mediated the breakaway conflicts in Georgia, so Abkhazia, South Ossetia. I saw firsthand how nefarious Russian peacekeepers can be in conflicts like these. What's different this time is I think Russia really does want to maintain the ceasefire, maintain stability as far as I can peer into the future. And most importantly, Turkey, therefore NATO, have eyes and ears on the ground with Turkish peacekeepers participating in a modest way, but participating in the peacekeeping operations. That said, I think the structure allows for stability, but Armenian politics now are totally unstable. There's going to be a national election on the 20th of June. Whereas the current prime minister was originally, it looked like he was going to get thrown out of office, maybe by street protests. He's actually doing quite well in this election. So whoever wins until that election, nobody in Armenia, in the political class, can say, you know what, we should accept this outcome of the war, and we should take up Azerbaijan on its offers to reopen transit routes and build regional economic cooperation and incorporate Armenia and all that. Because if any Armenian politician does that now, ahead of the election, he or she will be accused of being a traitor, of not being a patriot, and will end their political career. So a lot is riding on this Armenian election. But as each week passes, it seems to me more and more Armenians are starting to understand that the previous myths that drove their foreign policy, that Armenian military is invincible, that Azerbaijanis don't know how to fight, that those lands to the east around Nagorno-Karabakh are really Armenian lands. Those myths are being broken apart now, including by Armenian wise people like former foreign policy advisor to the first president of Armenia after the Soviet Union collapsed, Gerard Libredian. It's a very painful process for the Armenians. So then that gets to my last point, which is there is a lot of tension in the western areas that were recovered by Azerbaijan as a result of the war. There have been reports of armed clashes. I haven't seen any convincing evidence of any weapons being used, but it is true that Azerbaijani troops have moved back into the previously occupied Azerbaijani lands. Some of the Azeri troops seem to have moved maybe 3.5 kilometers into Armenia to fortify the defenses of the troops on Armenian soil. And this is leading to tension. But the last point is it is also leading to something positive, with Russia apparently mediating border demarcation negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Pashinyan, the prime minister of Armenia, has admitted that those talks are going on. And this too is becoming a political issue in the upcoming election in Armenia. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bryza. Mr. Berman and Mr. Ponchurak, anything else to add on it?
Yeah, I would just say, so Matt knows much more about this than I do. I would just say that, the points that, just to reemphasize a couple of the points that he made, is that I think this is, in hindsight being 2020, sort of looking at the conflict, we can see that there was a tremendous amount of miscalculation on the Armenian side. And there's now the demolishment of myths. Myths, for example, about Armenian military robustness, myths about how much, for example, Russia would support Armenia in the conflict. So to me, what's left now is this really interesting dynamic political time. And there's a couple of questions that arise to me. first of all, has the conflict brought lasting peace, sort of, or more durable peace, closer or further away? I tend to sort of to be optimistic the way Matt is, that we're now seeing this sort of this movement into sort of, if not a resolution, then a more sort of pacific settlement over time. The second question is, what does this do for Armenian domestic politics? Because Matt's absolutely right. Pashinyan, for a whole host of reasons, grossly miscalculated his country and his government's political position, its relative strength, and who it can count on. Does this make Armenia move in the direct? I mean, and Pashinyan, paradoxically, was brought to power because of this pro-Western reformist tilt that was taking place in Armenia. So to me, the real $64,000 question is, what happens to that? What happens within Armenia? Does Armenia, in a weakened state post-conflict, does it continue to tilt towards the West, or does it sort of tilt back towards Russia? And that leaves, I think, the third big question, right? Because in conflicts like this, it's always a question of what does this do for Russia, and how does this make Russia react, and how does this sort of position Russia vis-a-vis Europe and vis-a-vis the West? And I think that's a really interesting question. And the Russians, for now, I think are acting in this conflict, at least, in a more constructive fashion than they have in previous ones, for example, in Georgia. But the Kremlin compliance and Kremlin cooperation is never an indefinite prospect. And so this is actually, it's interesting to me whether or not this issue is going to become significant enough that it gets on the agenda of the June 16th meeting between President Biden and President Putin, because the whole point of that meeting, which is going to happen in Switzerland, is going to be to see if we can start a durable strategic dialogue to de-escalate tensions. And the Caucasus is very obviously part of that conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Roman. Mr. Poncharak,
yeah,
please.
just let me add just one consideration, which is a bit peripheral, if you wish, from the actual, hard problems that my colleagues here have quite competently described. I'm looking at this from a slightly different perspective, and I'm looking at it from the perspective that is being discussed a great deal here in Washington about relations between Ankara and Moscow. It seems to me that the Armenian-Azeri conflict on Nagorno-Karabakh is another indication to me that the interests of Moscow and Ankara are not really aligned. So we've been wondering, and the issue hasn't been settled at all. Is Ankara still a member in good standing of NATO? I guess technically yes, but many wonder. And Matthew, I'm sure, knows a thing or two about all this discussion. So what I'm trying to say is this: if you look at the crisis points at the periphery of Turkey, this one that has been just discussed. Let's not forget the Black Sea, where you are, Matthew, right now on the northern shore, Ukraine and Russia. Is a Russian aggressive military posture in the region in Turkey's interest? I don't think so. Then let's shift south, Syria, Idlib, and Turkey's interest in protecting the refugees there and obviously being at odds with Damascus, supported by Russia. What I'm trying to say is this. I don't quite understand where the value proposition is for Turkey to try to somewhat ameliorate its bilateral relationship with Moscow, considering that the interests of the two countries are really not aligned. The only thing that may be in Turkey's interest is to continue to be a conduit to the West of Russian hydrocarbons. And yes, of course, we've got the S-400 issue that still has not been settled in a positive way with the sanctions that have hit Turkey on account of this, which is a clear violation of US law. So I'm just making a general consideration. I don't really know the answer to this, but I think that the diplomats and policymakers in Ankara should look at all this and to say, well, these Russian friends, how good are they? I mean, where is our home ultimately, as Ilan, I think, was saying? Where do we want to be? We want to be straddled here in the middle between East and West and and try to play the two sides against the other, which is a perception that some people have in Washington, or ultimately we belong in the West. We are a NATO country. We aspire to stronger economic and trade and cultural relations with Western countries, of course, Europe being in the neighborhood, needless to say, and ultimately the United States, including this plan to strengthen American investments in Turkey that Matthew alluded to before. So I think this is something that I hope will be considered by policymakers in Turkey in the light of the composite, the collage that comes out of this picture, which shows to me that the interests of Russia and Turkey are not aligned.
Thank you. As you may aware of, Turkey recently sold 24 armed UAVs to Poland. The Polish president days ago was in Ankara, in town, and actually it drew a lot of attention from all over the world. Turkey's these UAVs and armed UAVs changed the destiny of many clashes and wars in the area in recent months and in recent years, like Libya and in Syria, also recently in Azerbaijan, in Nagorno-Karabakh area. Therefore, this kind of sales by Turkey, Turkish-made UAVs and armed UAVs, not also to Warsaw, also to Ukraine. Such kind of sales, in my opinion, will not make Russia happy in the future, because when you look at the recent announcements by Sergei Lavrov or some other Russian people, they actually raised their concerns against Turkey, saying that the Russian attitude will not look at such things happily, something like that. We understand something is coming up on this issue. Also, it's directly related with Azerbaijan issue as well. I just wanted to remind that. Mr. Berman, we have an issue, very, very tough issue. Hope before 14th of June, you may help us to solve this issue, because this question is, how can Turkey and Russia move forward with the disagreements on the S-400 missiles, Russian-made S-400 missiles? Yes, on the other hand side, Russia is not happy with our sales to Poland and some other countries, to Ukraine. But on this side, also, we have Russian-made S-400 missiles. In my opinion, decision was right, because Turkey tried a lot to buy Patriot missiles. Maybe Matt Price, I remember, there were some difficulties on the way to Washington, especially at the Congress. So also this S-400 issue is directly related, linked to F-45 warplanes, which is just suspended by United States, and Turkey is taken out of the program. Do you think that there could be a solution, or there could be any move to solve this issue on the day of 14th of June in Brussels between the two presidents? Because this is lacking all the system.
Right. So again, another hard question. Let me see if I can address it as best I can, because I actually think that what you're talking about is part of a larger issue, and it's something that Paulo and I have talked about a lot. But the S-400, sort of the dispute over the S-400, is part of a larger set of disagreements that exist, right? And Turkey has its own set of complaints against the United States, which include the Gulen movement, which include the U.S. arming of Kurdish militias, Kurdish Peshmerga militias in Iraq and Syria. And the U.S., on the U.S. side, has a different set, right? It's Turkey's role in, for example, in the past, sanctions busting by Iran, the S-400 issue. But underlying it all is, I think, something that's very important and doesn't get talked about enough. It's the sort of a crisis of confidence that exists between the two countries. It's in the United States here. You now have a very polarized, like in most things, political debate about Turkey. On the one hand, you have people who believe that Turkey's sort of ideological repositioning, its international relations, including what appears to some Americans as a Turkish-Russian alliance, although I think Paulo did a great job of sort of explaining why that perception is not clear. But nonetheless, the perception persists among some, and it's created an urge among some parts of the policy community in Washington to say, you know what, Turkey is lost to us, and we need to punish, we need to exclude, right? That's where the conversation about ejecting Turkey from NATO comes from. And on the other hand, there is a series of policymakers, a group of policymakers who focus sort of very narrowly on the the points of commonality and don't look at the points of discord. And they say Turkey is the most important ally that we have in Eurasia, and we should paper over the disagreements that we have and just focus on areas of cooperation. And so, you know, you have these two in the United States, you have these two very different political positions, and they're each arguing. And I would from my point of view, I think something in the middle is necessary, right? If you could call it that, a Turkey consensus in the United States, where it recognizes Turkey's role in the West, it recognizes Turkey's material contributions to NATO. It recognizes, by the way, that NATO does not have a mechanism to eject Turkey, and that NATO was never intended as a moral alliance. It was intended as a security alliance, and Turkey has been fulfilling those roles. But at the same time, doesn't paper over the disagreements that we have and sort of engages deeply with Ankara on, for example, concerns that we have about Turkish-Russian alignment, about Turkish-Iranian alignment, things like that. That's a conversation that needs to happen in the United States, but it needs to happen with our friend in Turkey. And so, you know, my fervent hope here, I think, is that the conversation that the two presidents will have in mid-June, is going to be, it's at least an opportunity to jumpstart that conversation, to have a sort of a middle of the road, a sort of a centrist conversation about things we agree on, about things we don't agree on, about building a path forward. Because, you know, and I'm sure you've heard this, every year Turkish columnists and commentators say this is the worst year ever for U.S.-Turkish relations, right? And every year it gets a little bit worse. And so reversing that trend, I think, should be a huge priority. It's an overriding interest for the United States to keep Turkey in the West, to not ostracize Turkey, to include Turkey, and make it a constructive partner. But it's true, I think, that Turkey is now seen as a troublesome ally by many in the United States. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done. The last administration didn't really engage very deeply on Turkey. It sort of saw Turkey as a function of other things that it wanted to do in the region. It wanted to depart from Syria. And so the conversation was about the role that Turkey could play in Syria. It was sort of eager to have a hands-off approach after the collapse of ISIS. And so, but this does not equate to a full American strategy towards Turkey. So, you know, my fervent wish is that in a couple of weeks' time, we see politicians on both sides stop with the blame and begin having a serious conversation about what the points of commonality are in order to build a positive agenda.
The magical word you have used is something in the middle. Something in the middle should be between what US says S-400 missiles should not be even on Turkish soil, and Turkey said it would not mix up with these missiles with NATO system. Something in the middle is in between the two things. Anyway, is there anything else you would like to add, Mr. Reiser, Mr.
Yeah, I would like, if I may, just to echo what Ilan was saying, I just would like make what I think it's a pretty pedestrian, obvious consideration, that if the party here in Washington that says we lost Turkey, they're out of the reservation, or worse, they are on the other side. Then assume that there were a system to evict a member from NATO, which, as Ilan pointed out, doesn't really exist. Imagine NATO without Turkey. Okay, let's do this a little kind of a fanciful exercise. Would we be better off? In other words, from a purely pragmatic, even cynical standpoint, if Turkey is no longer a NATO ally, if we no longer engage and continue the conversation on shared security issues and concerns in the region, so we're going to do, instead of Turkey, what is it going to be? Saudi Arabia? I don't think so. I don't think Egypt. I don't think so. Iran? Of course not. We got a few problems. So in other words, it seems to me that like it or not, from a purely pragmatic standpoint, non-ideological standpoint, in the region, and I know this is a cliche, but Turkey continues to be an indispensable ally. Therefore, I concur with Ilan, and I say, I hope that a sort of a pragmatic, utilitaristic, if you wish, utilitarian approach is, okay, let's not focus on differences. Let's try to focus on things in which we are united. At GPI, we just had recently an event on Black Sea security, and we were, educated about various efforts that Turkey is in the lead of, trying to create confidence-building measures among all the littoral states on the Black Sea. And I think this is a very useful role that Turkey is playing, and that certainly the United States cannot play because it's not a littoral country, and certainly Romania and Bulgaria as NATO members are not going to undertake. So my larger point is that notwithstanding all these differences, which are not minor, that a common ground could and should be found. And also, I'm kind of mixing things that probably don't belong. But the very fact that the Ankara government had a somewhat muted reaction to the issue we were discussing earlier, that is the Armenian genocide, to me is an indication of pragmatism. To say we're not going to be stuck on posturing on principle issues, but we're going to try to see where the common ground is. I hope that the attitude here in Washington in the Biden administration reciprocates this sort of a quiet pragmatism. And when the two leaders meet in Brussels, that this can be sort of a reigniting of a positive process of engagement, focusing on things that we have in common as opposed to the problem areas, which are still problem areas.
Thank you. Yes, Mirza.
I think Turkey, from its perspective, from President Erdogan's perspective, is doing exactly what Paolo suggested. It's not viewed that way in Washington because of sort of the toxicity of the Turkish brand that Ilan was referring to in political circles. But you think about the fact that Fethullah Gülen lives in Pennsylvania. Clearly, his people were the ones who organized the coup attempt. When you think that the U.S. is partnering with it's not the Peshmerga, Ilan, that are being armed and cooperating with the U.S. military. No, this is a terrorist organization, the YPG. The Peshmerga, I think Ankara is fine with arming the Peshmerga, but they just don't like a terrorist organization that seeks to create a political entity along Turkey's border. I think on the Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey is sending signals that it wants to be pragmatic, get away from that confrontational stance of last summer. And even now, yesterday, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, the Greek prime minister, said, yeah, well, I think we're going to be able to improve our relations. And I totally agree with both of my colleagues that you need to park the most difficult issues. So the YPG that I was just mentioning, got to park that to the side. The U.S. is going to continue working with the YPG. It's going to infuriate Turkey. But just like Turkey parked the Fethullah Gülen issue for a while, park that one. And then S-400s. This is, to me, is going to be, it risks a huge disappointment at the meeting between Biden and Erdogan, because I think President Erdogan thinks there is room for Biden to cut a deal. I don't know that there is a desire by Biden politically to cut a deal, but even if he wanted to, he doesn't have the legal space to do it, because in the National Defense Authorization Act, as you alluded to, Mr. Demir, it says that sanctions must remain on Turkey unless the S-400s are no longer on U.S. soil. I'm a Turkish soil.
Turkish soil.
Turkish soil. Full stop. There is no wiggle room. There's no waiver possibility. So what would have to happen is that Congress then would have to pass an amendment or a new provision, let's say in next year's National Defense Authorization Act. And the political climate is not at all ripe for that at all. So hopefully this first summit between Biden and Erdogan will lead to, this commitment, as Ilan was saying, to restart a dialogue about areas where our interests can overlap. But I worry President Erdogan's going to think, doggone it, I offered a negotiated path in the middle forward on S-400s, and Biden didn't take it. And that's because Biden can't legally find that middle path on that issue. Thanks.
Yeah. When the Sherman was in Ankara 2 days ago. I think she raised similar issues, what you said during your speech. Thank you very much. So another thing, Mr. von Schirach, there's a Netflix drama, Crown. Maybe you have seen it. It's actually tells the story of a British royal family. And although the royal family several times denied and strictly actually reacted to these claims in this drama, it's an interesting one. And also behind the scenes, historic cases could be learned from this drama. But of course, first of all, you should read it, but it gives you also kind of view. I've been actually closely following this British history for years, and it drew my attention, to be honest. I strongly advise you to watch it if you actually haven't seen it so far. I would like to speak about United Kingdom this time with you, because after Brexit, United Kingdom's foreign policy has been testing new waters. And I realized that they actually try to improve strategically and interestingly ties with Turkey as well. Developing ties with Turkey, as an example, is a very, very strange issue. Do you think that is UK preparing to play a decisive or different role, more independently than its ties with the United States? Because the UK should be taken into account in this global balances as well. Do you think the future of the world and the future of UK will actually get together one day, or UK will actually pave another way for itself?
Look, we have to distinguish, I think, when we're talking about Great Britain, from the security dimension and the trade, economics, and investment dimension. Of course, I do not believe, I do not see, and I do not foresee any major changes in Britain's posture when it comes to global security. Its relationship with the United States is firm and strong. There's no question about the enduring value of Great Britain as a founding member of the NATO alliance. There was a speculation, incidentally, in the American media as to the fact that the decision by the British government, this is kind of a tactical decision, to deploy an aircraft carrier in the Pacific now is to give a hand to Uncle Sam here in Washington, because we seem to be short on carriers right now. And therefore, to boost the Western military presence in the Pacific. Just a small illustration of what may be some kind of an informal arrangement between the two navies of the UK and the United States. But coming to your question about potentially strengthening trade and investment relations with Turkey, I think the British are looking everywhere, all over the world, trying to reposition Britain somehow as a global Hong Kong, if you wish, without China. So saying, okay, now we are unshackled, we are free, we are no longer dependent on framework agreements decided upon by Brussels, and we can do our own thing. Of course, top of the agenda, I think, is the possibility, which seems to be a little complicated, to have a major free trade agreement between the UK and the United States. This has been sold politically as some kind of nirvana, as some kind of magic solution that will really boost the British economy and whatnot. There are problems and complexities in accomplishing this. But more broadly, I think that Britain has now the freedom to look at the world chessboard and see where opportunities may exist, that where Britain can leverage its position as a leading country, at least in the services industry, financial services and whatnot, and IT industry and pharmaceutical industry and aerospace and what have you, to reposition itself as a global player. More easily said than done. This is really complicated. Moving global supply chains and directing significant amounts of FDI from one place to another is really, really complicated. But in that context, I am really not surprised, and I would welcome, certainly, I don't see what the adverse elements could be here about any refocusing on the part of British foreign policy and trade and economic, international trade and economic policy makers on Turkey. I think there is opportunity there. I don't exactly know what the agenda is and what the sectors that could be privileged are, but I am sure there's a great deal that Britain can offer in terms of, and that certainly Turkey, I know, is welcoming FDI, whatever its, sources, because Turkey needs, more capital investments, and has created, it seems to me, a favorable business climate to welcome such investment. And so I would see that as a positive.
Thank you. Anything else to add? Please. You say no? Sorry.
That was comprehensive. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, this is actually could be kind of tough. That's why I would not ask this time to Mr. Berman. He has been directed 2 times with tough questions. This time I'm asking this question to 3 of you. Any of you would like to answer if you want. So this is about, actually, Madrid touched on this issue for a short time. It is US support to YPG in Syria. This actually seriously make Ankara very angry. And US support to YPG was expected to be one of the biggest obstacles to tackle with Biden's administration as well. Not S-400 missiles and F-35, something else. This is one of the top issues because it's directly related to Turkey's internal security. What do you say about it? Because this answer will help us to understand also in some way of the United States-Turkish relationships in the future as well. Would you like to say something else, Mr. Berman?
Let me just,
Schrack or Bryson?
If I may jump on this, but my 2 colleagues here, I'm sure have a lot more to say than being more closely connected to the region. My sense, having seen and experienced and being part of many of these dialogues on the YPG, and I remember, we had Ambassador James Jeffrey, as a guest at GPI before his appointment, as a special envoy, and then I see what he's written afterwards and whatnot. I think that there is an odd and unfortunate misunderstanding here in Washington and constant underplay as to the, the depth of the Turkish concerns about this matter of the YPG. I think it's being constantly underplayed. These Turks are all so mad about this, but they'll come over. They'll get over this because, after all, what we're doing with the YPG was all about the caliphate. This is what we were doing. And yes, there may be some problems with the connections across the border with the PKK, whatever. But come on, it's not such a big deal. I mean, I know this sounds kind of almost childish to frame it in this way, but to be honest with you, that's what I heard many times. They'll get over it because this is not such a big deal. And therefore, we are not arming terrorists. We Americans are not arming terrorists. This is not our goal. Our goal is, the fight against the caliphate and ISIL and whatnot. And the rest, can be pragmatically resolved. And of course, it has not been resolved, certainly from the perspective of Ankara, in a satisfactory manner, simply because the assumption here in Washington is wrong, it seems to me. Or at the very least, it does not take into account the seriousness and the commitment of the Turkish government in eliminating the terror threat coming from PKK separatists and terrorists and whatnot. And therefore, the significance of the connection between the PKK and other groups across the Syrian border. I think that is fundamentally the problem, that there is an inability to recognize the full implications of this support given to forces that are believed to be, with cause, inimical to Turkey and undermining Turkish security. And unless this is tackled constructively from this end here in Washington, I'm afraid a good solution to this problem will not be found. I don't know, if there will be kind of wiser heads in charge of this particular dossier here in Washington, who will really finally understand that to take Turkey's position and take it seriously. Because what I heard so many times from Turkish diplomats here in Washington is, Americans are supposed to be our friends. Why is it that they don't understand this? Are they our friends or are they friends of the terrorists? I heard this many, many, many times over the years. And I think that there's some kind of tone deafness here that fails to appreciate how serious this problem is. And by the way, how it unites, it seems to me, Turkish political forces across the spectrum, how sensitive this matter is. So I really hope that, a more sympathetic appreciation of how much this is felt in Turkey will develop here in Washington, so that we can be engaged more constructively, and that Turkey believes that America is a partner in this and not, as they are led to believe, supporting an enemy.
Thank you. We don't have much time, but I would love to hear both of you, Mr. Berman and Mr. Breiza. Please go on, Mr. Berman.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. So first of all, Matt, I think you're right? I was sort of using Peshmerga as a term of art. I think there's a larger conversation about how the Turkish government aligns vis-a-vis empowerment of the Kurds, leading to sovereignty, things like that. I mean, that for another time. But I think you're absolutely right. And let me just point out, though, that we're in the process of trying to solve foreign policy problems. But not all foreign policy problems actually have a ready solution. And this is something that I spent quite a bit of time talking to folks in the Trump administration when it was in office about this precise issue. So historically, it's useful to remember that this was a problem that was inherited by the Trump administration from the Obama administration. And the Trump administration did not have a good solution for resolving the situation to Turkey's satisfaction, right? They said, people like Jim Jeffrey and Joel Rayburn said things like, we'll, after we get rid of ISIS, we'll disarm the YPG, we'll sort of do, and obviously sort of not a functionally practical plan. But I think Paulo is exactly right. This is an issue that is much higher on the Turkish strategic agenda than it is understood to be by us Americans. And it's something that a resolution to which would actually do a tremendous amount in terms of building confidence in the durability of US-Turkish ties. And it's something that I hope the Biden administration will focus on, especially since the Biden administration, in the way it's thinking about Syria, the useful thing, of course, in Washington is to say that, a new administration does exactly the opposite of the last one. But when it comes to things like Syria, when it comes to things like Afghanistan, you're seeing much more continuity than change in the transition from Trump to Biden. And so what you have is a Biden administration that's getting out of Afghanistan, just slightly slower. And you also have a Biden administration that also does not really want to recapitalize the American military investment in Syria and Iraq, now that the Islamic State's caliphate has been destroyed. And I think that provides an opportunity for Ankara and Washington to have a conversation about a rollback of American support, as long as there is, the situation is stable, ISIS is not allowed to resurge and to return. There is at least the basis for a new conversation. So I'm hopeful on that score.
Thank you. Mr. Breiza?
Yeah, a couple of points I'm eagerly waiting to make. I think that the policy is largely going to remain consistent because the person who was the lead engineer on the U.S. policy of partnering with the YPG is Brett McGurk, who's the chief Middle East advisor in the Biden White House. And then finally, there are two more points. One, this happened, the U.S. partnering with the YPG with full understanding in the Obama administration of how contradictory this policy is to US policy of now working with one terrorist organization against another. There were heated debates between some of my friends on one side and some of my friends on the other side, and the people in favor of or against working with the YPG lost the debate, and Brett McGurk's side won. But that was a conscious decision. We know Turkey was going to freak out if we did it, and we knew it was contradictory to our own approach. So then my last point is what that has led to is a disingenuous attempt in some circles in the US government to pretend the YPG is something that it's not, and to pretend that it's not a terrorist organization. It is. I had the information in my safe when I was still working at the State Department. It is a terrorist organization. It is the PKK. It's just located in Syria. So what has happened then, the description of Turkey that is prevalent in all over the place, even the great David Ignatius, the Washington Post columnist, writes that Turkey, but by the U.S. pulling out of northern Syria, the U.S. President Trump cleared the way for Turkey to slaughter the Kurds. Those are his exact words, slaughter the Kurds. Turkey doesn't want to slaughter any Kurds. Turkey has maybe 1/3 of its population that's Kurdish. Turgut Özal was Kurdish, right? So there's nothing against Kurds. Quite the contrary. There's something against this one terrorist organization. But the whole narrative has been twisted with the Washington Post itself culpable to make it acceptable, to pretend that the U.S. isn't working with one terrorist group against another terrorist group. I know President Biden understands this calculus, and I hope he's going to do what Ilan and what Paulo just suggested, which is maybe in a way find a way to turn over a new page when he meets with President Erdogan. But I think they're going to have to park this issue to the side at the end of the day. Thanks. Mr.
Weiser, thank you. You're right. Totally right. Mr. Ilan Berman, Mr. Matt Weiser, and Mr. Paulo von Schirach, many thanks. Thank you very much to all three of you. Mr. Weiser, Mr. Berman, and Mr. Schirach actually provided us some incredible information and new actually views. Thanks for all again. It's been a pleasure being with all of you today. And also it's been an honor to be among such distinguished people, names, and also many thanks to the dear audience as well. The dear friend Burak Güntay and Bahçeşehir University. Hope to see you in next seminars, hopefully COVID-free face-to-face seminars. Thank you very much.
Great moderating. Thank you, Mr. Demir. And thank you, Burak.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to the whole BAU team for bringing us together. Thank you.